So thank you very much, Farokh. Thank you very much, Khaki Tours. Thank you very much, the whole team at Khaki, and of course, Bharat, who I've known for many years from when he launched Khaki Tours, and I've seen him grow so beautifully with it, and all of you all grow with him, and he with you also. This is a really lovely endeavor, and I think that the work that Khaki is doing is truly lovely work, and the city needs much more of this kind of advocacy and prachar for its heritage and saving its heritage. So thank you for doing such a lovely job, and thank you for inviting me to speak. Um, I think I need to thank Sridhar also for asking me to talk about this topic over here after he heard me elsewhere. And I will try my damnedest to do justice to this topic. But if I don't, I humbly apologize at the start. So Tagara Putra Times is the topic for the day. And essentially what we're going to be talking about is about a very, very little known dynasty known as the Shilahara dynasty and Greater Mumbai. Now by Greater Mumbai, I mean Mumbai and the environments around it. So this includes Salsette, it includes north of Salsette into Agasaim, and it includes into the mainland all the way perhaps to Nagaon and Akshi and places like that. So this is in a loose way to understand that no city stands by itself. No entity in ancient India is so concise that it can be only a small city state without an outlying region to it. And of course, by the medieval period, which we're going to be discussing, this is a impossibility altogether. This is the place that started off my tryst with the Shilaharas and my tryst with the pre-Portuguese history of Mumbai. It's a lovely little place called Banganga Tank, and Khaki Tours does a lovely walk over here. I used to come to Banganga because nobody came to Banganga back then, unless there were small groups of people carrying out tiny little ceremonies, mundans, immersing the ashes of the dead, so on and so forth. And there were a number of temples which you can see. I mean, if you look carefully, there's one here, there's one here, there's one here, there's another one here. This is the main Valkeshwar temple. And this is a tank. To me, it was just a tank and a lovely place to sit at. I was in my first year BA. I had a scooter of my own. This was sometime a very long time ago, never mind, makes me feel old. So I'd come here with a book and a bottle of water and a packet of Monaco biscuits and spend half the day at this lovely, cool tank. I was sitting here one day when a lovely little rotund Pujari gentleman came with a group of people who looked very, very North Indian to me. And he spoke in very chaste North Indian Hindi. And he was showing them around the tank and pointing out the various temples to them and giving them a guided tour after whatever they had to do had been done. And if you look very carefully, you can see a pole in the center of the water tank. Now, this is normally kept where there is a spring, where there is no flooring in a water tank. And it also helps to note the amount of water in the water tank because you know the height of the pole itself. And this is when he stood not far from me and told those people who had come there the story of Banganga. And he told them that Banganga was built thousands of years ago. So my ears immediately perked up as a student of ancient Indian culture and history about something thousands of years old in Mumbai. And he said that when Lord Ram and Lord Lakshman, along with Sita, Maya, came down the coast to Mumbai. I mean, till then I didn't know that Lord Ram had been to Mumbai on his Bharat Darshan. And he said when he came here, he was enthralled by the beauty of Chowpatty Beach. That sounded even more interesting. And he then went on to say that he lost track of time and suddenly realized that it was almost sunset and it was time for his daily prayers to Lord Shiva. So with his hands, he brought sand together to make a makeshift shivling. And he asked Lakshmana to get him fresh water. And Lakshmana probably, I mean, I can just see Lakshman wondering about here on the beach, inside of the sea, like, you're serious, man. And, but you know, this was Brata Ram, and if Brata Ram said, get fresh water, you got fresh water. Well, guess what happened? Knowing that there was no other way to do this, Lakshmana reached out to the quiver on his back pulled out one of his special arrows and shot it deep into the ground, and the Ganga burst forth. And that kund that formed over there due to the arrow was the Ban Ganga tank, and therefore it is known as Ban Ganga, the Ganga that was brought thanks to the Ban of Lakshmana. So this sounded like a beautiful mythological story. Until this point, I was completely with the Pujari. When he turned around and he pointed swiftly at the pole, there was much more water there. And he said, "Can you see that over there?" And everybody kind of turned around to look at this rather thick coconut tree that had been embedded in the center of the tank. And he said, that is it. Thousands of years later, Lord Lakshmana's Ban is still there as proof in the center of the tank. And everybody turned around with joint hands, folded hands, bowed their heads, and went away and left me completely gobsmacked. I was like, really? And people believe this? Wow. The power of faith. I mean, it's an amazing thing, isn't it? And then I wanted to know more about Ban Ganga. So I went back to Xavier's where I was doing my bachelor's, and I asked my teacher about it. And this is essentially what she told me. That the Valkeshwar temple had been built sometime in 1127 AD during the reign of the Shilahara dynasty by Lakshman Prabhu, a Gaud Saraswat Brahmin, or depending on who you believe, a Pathare Prabhu or a CKP. There are a number of options as to who he was. And Lakshman Prabhu actually built this temple here during the reign of the Shilahara dynasty in 1127 AD. The temple was later destroyed due to a number of reasons, and then finally resurrected again in the 18th and 19th centuries. And that this was a very holy precinct. It had always been so. And if we look at a couple of other pictures before we move into talking about the Shilaharas, and it's very, very close to the sea. It's actually ridiculously close to the sea. It's at a slight height from sea level, and it has never, to my knowledge, been known to run completely dry. So this is giving you a couple of aerial shots of Ban Ganga. And if you look on the bottom right-hand side, you will notice how close the sea is, not really very far away from this gorgeous tank that exists over here in the city of Bombay and is one of Bombay's least known major attractions. And I'm saying this, size-wise, it's a major attraction, but it's one of Mumbai's very, very little known attractions. It's strewn all over with all kinds of very, very interesting sculptures that belong to the Shilahara period, the post-Shilahara period. There is a cemetery attached to it, and there are some very, very fascinating temples. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is what Ban Ganga tank looks like, and some nice gentlemen brought a gaggle of geese and ducks here, and since then they've made the place look even prettier. And touch wood, a lot more people come here than they did before. I miss the sanctity and the quiet of the place, but it's nice to see people coming to visit it. But this is what made me very interested in this dynasty called the Shilaharas. And I subsequently decided to find out who they were and how come, if they were in Mumbai, I had never heard about them. So the Shilaharas are one of the most interesting, exciting dynasties of Mumbai's early medieval history. For those who do not know, Mumbai has a very, very hoary antiquarian past. It goes back all the way to the Middle Paleolithic period. We have Middle Paleolithic tools from Kandivli and a couple of other places. We have a lot of Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic type of tools scattered once again at Bandra, Marol, Manori, so on and so forth. And we know for a matter of fact that there was probably some kind of Bronze Age interaction in the Mad Irangal area, because we have a couple of kinds of tools that only exist in the Chalcolithic period. That said, there is very little work done on this because most of these sites sadly are completely lost to us today. And the site of the Kandivli school on the Kandivli Nala is completely plastered over, as is most of Mumbai today, by cement and tarmac. So the story of Mumbai's history then moves into the early historic period. We have the Shilaharas and the pre-Shilahara period, right from the 1st, 2nd century BC. We have caves in Mumbai. We can argue as to whether the Mahakali caves came first or the Kaneri caves, depending on which direction you're coming from. But we know definitely that there was very interesting Buddhist cave temple building at a very, very early period. at least 2000 years ago, if not more. The evidence again is very scant. Apart from the caves themselves, there is not much, and a lot has to be extrapolated from it. And the main urban center at that time was north of Bombay and not in the old Seven Islands. When I say Bombay, I mean the Seven Islands of Bombay, and was neither really in Salsette, but much more even to the north of Salsette. Salsette is basically Shashti. It stretches from Bandra upwards to the north, and Devnar was originally a separate island by itself. Well, the Portuguese had a very, very firm toe in this region, and they were removed from this region with very clinical skill during the reign of Peshwa Bajirao I by his brother Chimajiappa, who systematically defeated them from one stronghold to the other. We know that Mumbai and the Seven Islands were already in the hands of the British by 1661, and I won't go into that because that is very common history. What you should know is that by 1739, the Portuguese only held Daman to the north, and of course, due much north of that, and to the south, Goa and the southern territories, and the entire northern territory as such, with the exception of Damao or Daman, had been liberated by Chimajiappa, finally with the fall of Basin. One of the most intriguing of these was Thana, or Tana, as it was known to the Portuguese. And in the 1780s, it fell into the hands of the British. The Marathas kind of handed over this territory to them. That too is a lecture for a different day. When the British started working on clearing parts of the Tana Fort and in putting in their own structures into the fort, they came across two copper plates. And when the local Brahmins were called, nobody seemed to understand what was quite written on these plates, though it looked tantalizingly like Devanagari, but it wasn't. So this was in 1788, 1787, 1788, and General Karnak then took the plates with him to Calcutta and then very systematically analyzed the script and published the first English translation of the Thana plates of Arikesarin, dated to 1017 AD. And this is when, for the first time, we heard about a dynasty known as the Shilaharas. Much work has been done after that. Tulpule, M.G. Dikshit, and so many others have had various different inscriptions, which they have deciphered, stone inscriptions, copper plate grants, so on and so forth. But the person to go to if you want to really study the Shilaharas for the last 50 years almost is Vasudev Vishnu Mirashi. Now, nobody can talk about the Shilaharas without talking about the Corpus Inscriptionum Indicam, volume 6, published by the Archaeological Survey of India in 1977, 289 pages, 67 plates. Very difficult, sadly, to get one's hands on an original copy, but there are PDFs available on the net. Those of you all who would like to, I would advise you to take an image, shot and perhaps look this up. Vasudev Vishnu Mirashi was an absolutely brilliant man. It was at the age of 50 that he was grossly insulted by an epigraphist and called a Sanskritist. And he decided that he was going to take up epigraphy with a vengeance. And for almost the next 50 years till he died, he took on Indian epigraphy and published volume after volume. Inscriptions of the Vakatakas, inscriptions of the Kshatrapas, inscriptions of the Satavahanas, all of this was published by Vasudev Vishnu Mirashi. And to us, of course, the most important is this volume that I'm talking about here. Now, who are these Shilaharas? Where did they come from? And how did they quite end up being where they are? So there are three clear-cut branches of the Shillara dynasty and perhaps other small feudatories in Karnataka who also call themselves the Shilaharas and variation of the term Shilaharas at different points. The main branches of the Shilahara dynasty are the Northern Shilaharas, the Southern Shilaharas, and the Karad-Kolhapur branch of the Shilaharas. The southern branch of the Shilaharas ran out of steam very early, and by the very early 11th century were completely subsumed into the Kadamba Empire of Goa. The Karad or Kolhapur branch appear to be a later branch, and they're not really directly related, but definitely there were connections between the two. It is the Northern Shilaharas dynasty which we are going to be talking about, and on the left is a beautiful map from CII volume 6, which shows you the region which was essentially dominated by the Shilaharas. Now this is a very interesting region. This is the region known as Thane, Konkan Thane, or Thane-Konkan. And we know of it from various different sources. Ibn Battuta talks about it, Marco Polo talks about it. We have a beautiful grant from Deonar, which we have recently published, of 1368 AD, that also talks about the same place. So Thane-Konkan or Kukan Thane or Konkan Thane was a very well-known administrative, political, geopolitical entity of its own, at least from the 10th century AD onwards. Now, for all extents and purposes, essentially, we'll be talking about the Northern Shilaharas, because these are the ones in and around Mumbai, and you can see the various different fine spots and the way that they're scattered and clustered around Mumbai. And it's very, very obvious that this was the core region as such, where they ruled. So, before we go any further, the Shilaharas were essentially vassals originally of the Rashtrakutas. They were not a separate regnal dynasty, but they were vassals of the Rashtrakutas who ruled the northern Konkan in the name of the Rashtrakutas themselves. The known dates for them start roughly from the beginning of the 9th century AD, and you have Kapardin the first, Pulashakti, Kapardin the second, Vapuvana, Janja, Gogi, Vajada, Chadwai Deva, so on and so forth, all the way down to Anantadeva the first, also known as Anantapala, and then the later Shilaharas as such, from Anantadeva the first onwards, all the way down to Someshwara. Now there are a number of theories as to their origins, where they came from, who they were, why they were here, and where their original capital was. Suffice to say, every single early text talks about them occupying the same capital as an entity known as the Konkan Warriors. So we know of the Konkan Warriors thanks to Pulakeshin II, who talks about their capital city at Puri. We also know that the Chalukyas had invaded this territory and had extended their rule all the way from Badami all the way into Gujarat, and that this area was originally part of their fiefdom in the 8th and 9th centuries AD. It was only in the 9th century AD, with the rise of the Rashtrakutas, that we saw the vanquishing of the power of the Chalukyas, and this region then fell into the hands of the Rashtrakutas. The Rashtrakutas established their vassals here, originally ruling from Puri, and then later from their later capital at Shristhanake, or modern day Thana. Now there's a lot of debate about where Puri was. Many historians feel it is Gharapuri or Elephanta. As many others disagree. There are n number of permutations and combinations. I for one think that Gharapuri would be too tiny and too difficult to maintain decent contacts with the mainland in the kind of situation that it was, because there's quite a deep sea between the mainland on both sides, and you don't really want that small an area to be stuck on in case of emergencies, expansion, so on and so forth. So it doesn't really make much sense, though there is evidence of occupation of the site during that period. Suffice to say again, it is Shristhanake where they moved to later, which is modern day Thana, that we are really interested in. And historians absolutely and completely are agreed upon the origins of this place called Shristhanake, that this is none other than Thane. Okay, and that the original name of Thane is Shristhanake. Therefore, we know that the Northern Shilaharas, once they had consolidated their fiefdom, their viceroyalty, whatever you want to call it, ruled from Shristhanake, and they used the title Mandaleshwara and subsequently the title Mahamandaleshwara. So this is where we found them first, at Shristhanake. There is a very interesting legend told on the copper plates of the Shilaharas themselves. And they claim descent from a Vidyadhara prince called Jimutavahana, son of Jimutuketu, who offered himself as a human sacrifice, a living sacrifice, to Vishnu's Mount Garuda to rescue a Naga called Shankhachuda. And it was this lying down in sacrifice on a stone, okay, that the name Shila Ahara, or food on a stone, is supposedly derived from. Now, I know it sounds a little difficult, also quite gruesome, but keeping in mind that this is the medieval period, there is a distinct possibility in this. You can agree or disagree. This is what they claim themselves. Surprisingly, at a later point, the Shilaras themselves refute the story. And Chadvaida Deva says that Shillara was actually a great warrior after whom the Shilaharas are named. And he saved the ocean from the arrow of Parshurama. And he challenged Parshurama himself. And that it is his valiant descendants that came to be known from his name as the Shilaharas. Okay. And that it is they who ruled in this region. What is very interesting is that before Chadwai Deva, who is very firmly entrenched in the Northern Konkan, the Shilahara dynasty originally originated in northern Karnataka and southern Maharashtra in the region that we know of as Marathwada. Almost all the Shilaharas very, very proudly call themselves Tagara Putrasa. And they talk about the beautiful city, the immaculate city, the great city, the princely city of Tagara from where they are. Now, we've known a lot about Tagara for a very long time. Tagara was known to us right from the periplus of the Erythraean Sea and from Ptolemy's geography. So from the 1st, 2nd century AD, we know about a very, very important site in this region. It is in Marathwada. It is the modern day town of Ter, which is now a sleepy little town. But right from the period of, well, the Mauryan period or the Mauryan times, though not necessarily Mauryan hegemony, it was a very, very important site. It was a very, very important city on the river Terna. The Tagara Putras are very, very proud of their heritage. And even though they spent many centuries ruling the Northern Konkan, they proudly still continue to call themselves Tagara Putras. And it was in the time of these Tagara Putras that we are going to discuss the political and socio-political events that took place in the city of Mumbai and the region around Mumbai. So the Shilaharas were all originally Kannada speakers, and this is very clear from the Kannada Birudas seen on the inscriptions. So for those who do not know, Birudas are very fancified titles which are used by medieval rulers. So he whose tread shakes the earth, he who's whiter than the whitest snow, he whose sword arm was like quicksilver, he whose horses had drunk the water of the 7 seas. I've always wondered why horses would drink seawater. So on and so on and so on and so forth. If you go down to Tamil Nadu, it gets even more complex. So the inscriptions of the Shilaharas, when they're on copper plates, usually start off by talking about the Rashtrakutas, the origins of the Rashtrakutas, and continue to the current Rashtrakuta ruler. They then go on to talk about their own origins and continue to the current Shilahara ruler, after which the actual land grant or whatever is being granted in the copper plates starts. So copper plates are normally 2 to 4 to 5 plates of inscribed data. More often than not, 75% of it has nothing to do with the grant for which this plate is being written. And epigraphists very often have very little hair because they pull most of it out, going through the birudas and the technicalities. But what these inscriptions tell us is not just about who was ruling when. They don't just tell us the genealogies of these dynasties, but they also tell us the names of the different ministers and officials. They tell us about rates of exchange. They tell us the names of local villages and towns. They tell us the names of local peoples who lived during those times. And they tell us very interestingly about various different religious affiliations that they had at various times. Somewhere around the early 11th century AD, we see the beginning of stone inscriptions or stone steles which are inscribed. And there is a very, very interesting type of stone inscription known as a gadegal. And it is on these gadegals that for the first time, we see not the Kannada infused Sanskrit of the inscriptions that we see elsewhere, but we also see the emergence of Marathi text. Now, this is the Akshi Gadegal, and it is now completely wiped out, and there's virtually not a single alphabet. There's one or two alphabets visible here in this area. If you go there, it was being worshipped by the locals for many years. It was regularly washed and scrubbed, and therefore all the inscription was here and below, is completely lost to us forever. Tulpule read this inscription earlier, and he said that the date was 1012 AD. There's been a lot of argument about this, about whether it's 1012 AD or 1112 AD and so on and so forth. But if it is 1012 AD, this is the earliest evidence of a Marathi inscription in Maharashtra to this day. Of course, you can discuss Marathi existing in other texts and other manners before this, and definitely we have a Marathi inscription from Kumuteshwara, which deals with the Western Ganga dynasty, which is a little earlier than this. What you see here is essentially a stele with a sun and a moon symbol. If you can see my cursor, this circle is the sun, this is the moon. What it basically means is, as long as the sun and the moon shall survive, that which is written on this edict, this stele, will also be valid. And then right at the end of the inscription, there is what is euphemistically called the deprecatory verse or the ass curse, which says that if you go against what is written here, or you do not follow the edict which is issued in the name of the king, then your mother will be forced to have sex with a donkey. And a little later, when it is in very clear Marathi, that line is a very, very clear Marathi line, I gadede zavize. Yes, I know. The position of women and the way in which women were raised on this pedestal of purity, and then therefore you could attack somebody the worst by attacking the purity of his women, is well, one of those things about the medieval period. So the Shilaharas were feudatories of the Rashtrakutas, as I said, and we know that the Chalukyas under Pulakesin were here. And finally, at the end of the 8th century AD, Danti Durga defeated them and installed himself as the imperial ruler. The next time we hear about the Shilaharas as such, or the first time we hear about them, is from a beautiful stone inscription at cave number 73 at Kaneri Caves in Mumbai. So we hear about them when Pulashakti, the son of Kapardin, who was the founder of the Shillara dynasty, gives a donation to a cave of the Buddhists over here. And this is very interesting because the Shilaharas are very well known to be Shaivites. And there's a lot of invocations to Shiva and to Ganapati depending on which ruler is giving the inscriptions and the donations. But surprisingly, there are a number of Buddhist donations that were given by them. We also know about Jain donations that were given by them and an entire Jain temple that was built by them. And the Karad branch actually built a Buddhist temple too. So it's a very interesting syncretic period where your own personal affiliation has nothing to do with the way in which you distribute your largesse to other communities. I know this does not look like much, but it's in a very, very fragile state. And believe me, if you go there, it is even worse off than this rubbing which was taken sometime during the 1930s. So there are two inscriptions there. Cave number 73 and cave number 78 both have two inscriptions. These are the inscriptions of Kapardin. The second now, this one, and this one is a little more legible. And if you look at it very clearly, you can actually see alphabets and letters in it. And this is the kind of stuff that epigraphists have to work with. So it is about the middle of the 10th century AD that we first start getting juicy details about the Shilaharas. And this is the copper plate grant of Chadvaida Deva. Now, by the time Chadvaida Deva comes around, the Shilaharas have been here in this region for somewhere between 100 and 150 years. And they are now beginning to assert themselves in their own rights. And Chadvaida Deva changes the story of his family briefly and talks about how Shillara was this great mighty warrior who stopped the arrow of Parshuram. So this is approximately dated 950 because of the ruler Krishna III who is referred to and whose vassal Shadvaida Deva is. And we don't really surprisingly have a date on this copper plate grant, which is very, very peculiar, because most copper plate grants have very, very good dates, but the date here is not clear at all. It's a land grant, and interestingly, it talks about two very interesting villages that border the land grant called Vakhola and Sakala Naka. And I, for one, am very tempted to translate them as Vakola and Sakinaka. But the epigraphists feel that this is actually an inscription which is making a donation somewhere near Karjat. So I'm kind of quite lost. But for somebody from Thana to be making a donation to Vakola and Sakinaka makes much more sense to me than for a similar such donation being made there. And if so, this is the first mention of these two villages that we have during this period, and the first inroads into the Salsette region that are being made by the Shilaharas. I'm going to bore you with a lot of these images. This is where it gets a little clearer as the images go by. This is a copper plate grant of Aparaditya I, granting the village of Bhadana, which is actually a known village today, 9 kilometers from Bhiwandi, and is dated 997. It talks about the Ullas River and its original name, the Kumbhari. It talks about the village of Padiga. It talks about Vadavali. It talks about Lavana Tata or Lavane Tata, which is basically Lonad, where there was a sun temple. And we know that there is a beautiful temple today, a Shaivite temple at Lonad. And here we find mention of Sthanaka for the first time as the capital of the Shilaharas. Then you have the Thane copper plates of Arikesarin, son of Aparajita Deva, dated 1016 AD, which are from the Tana Fort itself. And this is one of the two plates. And this is a eye copy, as it's called, and a photograph of the eye copy. So you can see the letters looking much more clearer and tantalizingly identifiable. In fact, some of the letters are very clear to us even today. This is the Tana Fort, and it's one of the most beautiful surviving star forts of the Portuguese period. And at the bottom, you'll see a beautiful British painting of Thana when the British had taken over the place. And you can see how there is absolutely no housing around it on the landward side away from the creek. So this was being turned into a jail and into a barracks. And while the foundation work was going on, this very beautiful copper plate of Arikesarin was found over there. Thana is full of the remains of the Shilaharas even today. Much to our surprise, when we started doing a foot survey called the Salsette Explorations Project, which was a joint survey between the Center for Extramural Studies, University of Mumbai, the India Study Center Trust, and the Satya College. It was led by Dr. Suraj Pandit and myself. He was the director, I was the co-director. We had teams on the ground scouring the streets and the compounds of Mumbai, especially the Salsette part of Mumbai, the Salsette island of Mumbai, and we were hoping to find archaeological remains. We had no clue as to the sheer wealth of data that would emerge from this. There's a beautiful Shaivite Gana on the top left. There's a beautiful fragment from the temple building itself. There's a lovely image of Bhairava, which has sadly now been painted silver color for some reason on the bottom left. And you can see other elements over there, including a broken hero stone fragment in the center on the top. This is the Gaunderi Mandir at Thane. And if you look very carefully on the top image on the extreme left-hand side, there is a Kuta Shikara from a much larger temple, again belonging to the Shillara Yadava style, as it's often called. This is the Ghantali temple. Almost everything in the Ghantali temple has been Jirnodhard and renovated, but the door jamb of the temple is still original. And on the doorstep, you can still see the original work belonging to that period. While working at Ghodbandar Fort and digging illegally for soil, this beautiful image was found, which is now in the Thane Museum. We also have other material from Ghodbandar Fort. This is to give you a location of the fort. It was a very critically important port site during those days. And we have some beautiful Chinese ceramics from there. This is the Kopineshwar temple at opposite Masunda Talao. And in and around and embedded in the temple are some very interesting remains. On the left hand side, you have this gigantic Chaturmukha Shivalinga. It's one of the larger Shivlings in Maharashtra. There is debate as to whether this is Shilahara or Maratha period, so I won't get into that. But what is interesting is what the other three images that you see here at the Kopineshwar temple. On the right hand side is again a very large Kuta Shikhara, uh, which sits outside an Upahar Graha over there called Shri Upahar Graha. It was dug up when the foundations of a building adjoining Shri Upahar Graha were being built, and the gentleman there paid the magnificent sum of 50 rupees to the local laborers to have them bring it over and place it outside his Upahar Graha, and for which we are very, very grateful to him. There's also a beautiful Veena player on the top, embedded in the Kopineshwar temple. But most interestingly, what you see on the bottom left hand side are two classic Shilahara era pillar fragments, and they've been turned into this beautiful bench for people to sit in the compound. And I have even seen a fragment like this, which sadly is not there any longer, in the John the Baptist Church compound. So there are interesting, tantalizing glimpses of this era. We hit the jackpot at the police lines, a number of kichakas, a beautiful sculptured head with the mukuta on it, and a marble lintel from a Jaina shrine dating to the 12th century AD. You can see the Tirthankara on the top in the center, and it's very, very clear. Now, we know Jain presence in Thane today has a history that is more than 150 years old. In fact, they're quite categoric about it. So it's very interesting to know that the Jains had a very, very strong presence, strong enough to build this kind of a shrine in the 12th century AD. So we found, as I said, some very, very intriguing and very peculiar. So there's another early medieval Bharwaka on the left-hand side, definite Shaivite influences, and a very, very weathered sculptural fragment, which probably is a Chapeta Hanuman, but is a little difficult to say because of the degree of weathering. So if we thought that was the jackpot, it got even better at the Siddheshwar temple next to Siddheshwar Talav, which is sadly completely encroached on about 70% of its boundary by slums. The Thane Municipal Corporation has built a wall to keep the lake from being surreptitiously filled in the night, and houses being extended into the water, which has already happened. It's too painful to even show those aerial images. But while desilting the tank, some amazing Vaishnavite sculptures were recovered from here. There's a beautiful image on the left-hand side. There's a standing Vishnu image on the right-hand side. We can debate its absolute origins a little later, but you also have this beautiful earlier image, definitely of the Shillara period, with this beautiful Prabhavali on top of it over here. And of course, this sadhu seated over here, again from the same period. We then go to the area of Bhandup, and we have the famous Bhandup copper plates of Chittaraja, which were actually collected by a man to whom the Bhandup area had been leased out by the British, called Mr. Ashburner. And Mr. Ashburner was very kind enough to share these so that rubbings could be made out of them. Sadly, to the best of my knowledge, nobody knows where these plates are today, but they've been very well recorded so that they can be read and reread by epigraphists. It mentions Shatashashti, so that is one of the earliest mentions of Shashti, or the Salsette Island. It mentions Thanaka, and it mentions the village of Naura, where the grant has been given, which is none other than modern Nahur, which is adjacent to Bhandup today. There is no mention at all of the Rashtrakutas. So Chittaraja for the first time is Mahamandaleshwara in 1026 AD, and there is no mention of the Rashtrakutas. And this is when we are sure that the Shilaharas become an independent dynasty in their own right and are no longer vassals of anybody else. And to add to that, we have a beautiful Gadegal, which definitely had a land grant on it, probably still does, lovingly painted in ochre colored paint, and a hero stone with a bowman on it. You can see the bow and arrow, situated in the village of Bhandup East. And these are both worshipped today as Dev and Devi. To each their own. This is the Thane copper plate of Nagarjun, dated 1039 AD. And surprisingly, even though they were very partial to Shiva, the Chinna of the dynasty was Garuda. So Mumuni, who comes after that and who's a very well-known king, actually this is the copper plate, the second copper plate of Mumuni from his land grant, Thane copper grant. And this is the cut, sadly. There were 5 plates that were held together by this ring and this seal. And if you notice the seal carefully, there is a beautiful image of Garuda in it. And in 1048 AD, we have the Thane copper plate of Mumuni talking about the village of Ekasala on the Ulhas river, here specifically called the Ulhas, but all the rest of the villages appear to be near modern Karjat. So that is perhaps that there was at one time a separate river called the Ulhas and not our Ulhas today. Mumuni is also very, very well known, though sadly you cannot see this inscription any longer because in conservation work to keep the temple from falling down, the lintel on which this beautiful Ambarnath inscription was inscribed by his heir Chittaraja has been now covered by a slab of metal, an I-beam of metal completely covers this, but it's necessary to preserve what's left of this temple. And this is the Ambarnath temple inscription, and you can see an eye copy of it over here. It talks about how Chittaraja completed the temple that had been built originally by Mumuni. In 1060 AD, he finished this temple at the village of Patapali, which is probably the original name of Ambarnath. This is the plan of the Ambarnath temple for those of you who have not been there. It's a very, very beautiful temple with a typical Garbhagriha in a diamond-shaped building from which a Shikhara rises to the top. This was a typical Bhumija Shikhara, and these are the Bhumis. These little Kuta Shikharas that you see over here in layers, these are the Bhumis, and these are the Pattas. So you can see 2 of the Pattas over here, and there would have been 3 Pattas on 3 sides, or maybe even a 4th one sometimes, holding these small, as though they were all being bundled together with 4 straps. And then on top, there would have been an Amalaka and a Kalasha. This is the classic Bhumija style of architecture, which is seen during the reign of the Shilaharas, continues into the reign of the Rashtrakutas, and a little later. For those of you all who want to see a temple, an intact temple like this, all you need to go to Gondeshwar or to Sinnar to see this kind of a temple. In front of this is a beautiful octagonal mandapa. So please note 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there are 8 pillars holding up an octagonal mandapa. There are entrances technically from 3 sides. Okay. Though there is one smaller sub-shrine over here and entrances actually only from 2 sides, more or less. This has later been opened up to give an entrance here. This is the Garbhagriha itself. The rest of the building is packed solid with rubble, and there is beautifully carved stone masonry on the outside. Dr. Kumud Kanitkar has released a phenomenal book about this temple, and for those of you all who are into temple architecture, I humbly request you all to buy the book on Ambarnath. It's called Ambarnath Shivalaya, and it's a truly fabulous book. This is the Vihar Gadegal of Anantadeva, dated 1081 AD, and the Vadavali copper plate of Aparaditya I, dated 1127 AD. Vadavali, of course, is in Thane district. It's still there, about 6 kilometers north of Thane itself. So this, as you see, is from the CSMVS, the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangralaya, and it has been languishing on the balcony forever and ever. This is non-controversially dated the earliest Marathi inscription that we have. So unlike the Akshi inscription, which has some debate about it, there is no debate about Samvatsu over here, and it's 1081 AD. And there is the donation of the revenue of a village to a certain individual. Sadly, the lower part is too badly damaged for anybody to have deciphered it, but the inscription actually continued here, and you can see a few of the letters of 5 lines over here. The rest of it, of course, was buried in the ground. And there is the inset panel of the Gadegal, and of course the sun and the moon, Achandra Surya Viraje. We now come to the 6th, 7th century AD Brahmanical temple of Jogeshwari. And above the Brahmanical temple of Jogeshwari, there was a beautiful Gadegal inscription, which is known as the Jogeshwari Sintra inscription, which is now in Portugal at the Sintra Museum and was carted there by the Portuguese, who were completely dumbfounded as to what they had found. Belongs to Aparaditya the first, dated 1137 AD, and it actually has the name goddess Jogeshwari in it, and it talks about the houses, 13 houses of people directly related to the temple being completely exempt from any taxes, telling us that this Brahmanical temple was definitely in worship in the 12th century AD at Jogeshwari, and that there were houses around it even then. We then have inscriptions by Haripal Deva from Mahul, Aparaditya II at Lonard near Bhivandi, and so on and so forth. This is perhaps on the left the most beautifully executed Gadegal stone inscription of the Shilaharas. You have the moon, the sun, and a Mangal Kalasha denoting its auspicious nature. This is the Parel Gadegal of Aparaditya II, dated 1186 AD. And on the right is the Basin or the Vasai stone inscription of Anantadeva II. Now, this is where things get a little interesting. I'm sorry I don't have an actual image of this, but only a rubbing of the image. If you notice over here, you don't get the usual woman and the donkey, but you get a cow and a calf, or what's very often called a Savastadeno, or it's also called a Gai Vasru. And this is a very, very important chinna, says Mirashi. This is actually the personification of a land grant, where the land is the cow, where the person to whom the grant is given is the calf, and the benefit accrued from the grant, be it an orchard or a house or revenues or land or whatever it might be, is the milk that the calf is drinking from the cow. So these stones and these images are actually seen a little earlier in southern India, in Karnataka. They're also seen in the 10th century AD. They're also seen in the early 11th century AD amongst the Karad branch or the Kolhapur branch of the Shilaharas on their copper plates, especially Gangaraditya. And then we find them for the first time over here at Vasai. So this is a major shift taking place from year to year. We've subsequently found a large number of these stones, and we've actually found Gadegal stones belonging to a slightly later period, which have both the images side by side in much smaller sizes, telling you what the punishment is and what the benefit is of using these lands. So Parel, why Parel? So Parel has always been an incredibly important place. We have the great Parel heptad of the late or post Vakataka period that has been discovered there, which is known as the Bharadevi. The work done by Harshada Virkud, which has been published by her, talks about another Gai Vasru image from there. So perhaps there was a much larger stele there at one time, but only the cow and the calf, and there's always a ceremonial bowl-like structure in front of her from which she is consuming food, or well, whatever it is that she's consuming. And there is also, interestingly, a hero stone, and typical of the hero stone, showing the hero's death, his ascension to the heavens, and there his reaching heaven. In this case, he has reached Kailash. The worship of the Shivling is on of Mahadeva. The Shivling, interestingly, has this beautiful little bonnet, this tired bonnet on top, which is also commonly seen on Gangaraditya's copper plates and other places, and this priest officiating here. And if you look carefully, I want you to see the head gear of the priest. These are his jatas, which are tied around his head. And this kind of Natha affiliation of the jatas and the beard is something that is classically seen at every single Shillara sculptural site. At every temple, you have such siddhas that are shown over there, such sadhus that are shown over there. This is one of the most well-preserved Gadegal steles. This is the one from Chaudarpada. It used to lie in a field. Rupali Mokashi spoke to the villagers at Chaudarpada. Then I went and spoke there. Then Harshada Virkud went and spoke there. And we explained to them how this was a very, very important part of the history of their village. So Chaudarpada is now, of course, by the way, known as Shivnagar. They have renamed themselves. but they understood what we were talking about, and they carried this inscription with them carefully, washed it down, and placed it with a grill and a little plaque over there, and it's kept under lock and key so that nobody damages it any further, and it's still visible at the Shankar Parvati temple at the entrance of the village of Chaudarpada, where you can go. And Chaudarpada is barely 2 kilometers away, 2.5 kilometers away from Lonad temple. So this is a Gadegal of Deva dated to 1239 AD, and as a specific donation for Shiva worshippers, most probably those coming to the adjacent temple at Lonad, and that there was a property over here that was given from which monies were to be used to help the Shaivite worshippers. If you thought that these rulers were, well, were everything that we have here, there is much, much more to the histories and the influence of the Shilaharas. This that you see over here, please discount the lion in front. This is a modern stone lion. This that you see over here is something called a kichaka. It's lying on its side. This would be attached to a pillar over here. The square part would be attached on top of a pillar, and these are extensions outwards to hold beams. So it's known as a bharvaka or a kichaka. 1, 2, 3, and 4-sided kichakas are very common. 5-sided kichakas, as you see over here, are very, very uncommon. 5-sided kichakas very, very specifically mean that the temple here would have had an octagonal mandapa. And when we look at the plan at Ambarnath and we look at the plan at Lonad, we know that this was a preferred style of the Shilaharas. We also know from a text that Janja supposedly built 12 different temples to Shiva at an earlier period, but there is sadly no evidence of all 12. We think we might have found 1 or 2 others, but work is still on in that. This one single piece can give you the entire dimensions of the temple. Because everything in temple architecture is related, everything in temple architecture is always in ratios. And this tells us that the temple that stood over here was even larger than the Ambarnath temple. Now, this is the only stone fragment that came out intact when the Johnson compound was dug up and a large building was built at Mahim. And the watchman of the Johnson compound at that time snagged the stone.
I want you to write down just now a list of all the assignments.
Thank you, Preeti, for that. So the watchman took this away as a retirement fund and built a small temple. This is now worshipped as Amba Mata. But we surreptitiously went over there and removed the sari and took some pictures there. And Siddharth was very good and convinced the pujari to let us take them for purposes of research. And I think it is now also been painted since then. Mahim has, of course, been a very old place, very well known to us. We have an 8th century, 9th century AD stupa from Mahim. We have various other fragments belonging to an early period, and we have them from the area of the Shillara. We have a Shillara Kichaka and sculptural fragments and structural fragments from the Shitla Devi temple compound, telling us that there was once a much older temple over there. And then, of course, you have this beautiful votive stupa of the terminal Buddhist period. As though this wasn't enough, we have a large number of sculptural remains at the Mahim police station. Classically Shilahara period remains. There's a beautiful Shiva seated here with a shield. I'm sorry, I don't have a close-up of this. In Alangana Mudra, there is a very rare case of Vayu over here. And there is a beautiful Chapeta Hanuman and the entire story of Hanuman going to the Ashok Vatika and killing the youngest son of Ravana. And these are all embedded, if you look over here closely, they are all embedded at the bottom of these arcs. And the most interesting is this. So this is a classical image from that period, a hero stone, talking about the death of the hero here, the ascension of the hero, the arrival of the hero in heaven, the same priest with the same matted dreadlocks in a turban over here, offering worship, the hero and his wife, both shown here, which probably means that the wife committed sati. The Mahim hero stone is very rare because it shows a death at sea, and it also shows us what boats looked like at that period. And you can see the boat smashing onto the rocks. You can see an archer, a naval battle. You can see the body laid out over here. Okay. though he seems to be quite casual over here, and perhaps this is his wife, but this is how they met their end in a naval battle. And this is seen over here. We know that Mahim was a very important place, and these little scattered remnants that have been dug up at different times are all the remnants of the Shillara era temple that once stood over here. This is the beautiful Vayu. This is his scarf billowing in the background, held up by his upper left and upper right arm. There's Nakshamala here and a Gada over here. Dr. Jamketkar has very positively identified this, and Dr. Kubut Kanetkar says there's an almost identical one, though much more weathered, seen at Ambarnath. We also have a beautiful Gajalakshmi image near the Kundivite caves. These Gajalakshmi images are also very, very common, and at almost all the sites where we have Shillara inscriptions, somewhere or the other at temples, we have these beautiful Gajalakshmi images. There was at one time over there at Mulgaon Dongri in Marol a large temple. Sadly, only one pillar of that temple has survived. This is the Shri Kamla Mata Devi temple. That's Kamla Mata Devi, and we are very bad people. We keep taking off Kamla Mata's clothes and other Amba Devi's clothes. So when we moved the clothes to take a good picture, we realized that there is a bearded lady, as you can see over here. So there is a very male deity over here with a beard, which was part of this pillar. And this was a pillar fragment that belonged to a temple over here. At Mulgaon Dongri, we also have numerous kichakas, and we have an inscription sadly embedded in cement concrete, and we are unable to get it out. We hope that the State Department of Archaeology will do something about this. This is the kichaka, again, very similar to the ones that we've seen. This is a beautiful story of a sculptural fragment or a kichaka. Again, this is lying on its side. It needs to be on its face, and then there would have been a pillar under it, two projections. This kichaka is now worshipped as an image of Ganesha, and was actually found by forest workers who were clearing land and cutting grass over there. And one of them did not have any progeny, so everybody convinced him that if he took a rath to build a temple, uh, if he got a child, then he would do so. And when his wife delivered a child, he came back and he painted this and he built this tiny little shrine. It's on the RA road today. This is a amazing hero stone of that period from Bandra. This was found on the seashore at Bandra by Mr. Vikram Rao when he was barely 13 or 14 years old. He put it in a gunny bag, dragged it back because he was most intrigued by it, and thank God he saved it for us because there's a massive building where he found this stone. And it was only many years later when he did an archaeology course at the university that he realized what he dragged and what was lying in his godown. And since then he has cleaned it up nicely and mounted it very well in his office. If you think that is much, Juhu was probably a very, very important settlement during this period. We have some fascinating remnants of a massive temple from Juhu. This is a beautiful image of Vishnu and Lakshmi. We know it's Vishnu and Lakshmi because there's Garuda over here kneeling down. You can see Garuda's wings over here. And this is, as I said, Vishnu and Lakshmi over here. There is an Amalaka fragment of a temple next to it. These were all collected by a local gentleman who sadly passed away, and nobody knows exactly what the find spots in Juhu were of all of these. And his children have honestly said that they haven't the faintest clue because they don't have any written material about this. He collected a large number of fragments. So there is a female image, broken sculpture lying upside down. There are various Prabhavali fragments. There are various sculptural members. There are various structural members, over here and here. And again, you have the Mangal Kalasha on top of what would have been a massive hero stone, another hero stone fragment, a Nandi of a later period. The style of Nandi doesn't come in then. Again, sculptural members, structural members, sculptural members, so on and so forth from temple sides. A beautiful three-sided kichaka, a Gajalakshmi image. If you notice carefully, you'll see her arms, her waist, her legs, the two elephants on both sides, remnants of a pillar, the top of the roof, the inside, again of the Shillara Yadava style. So, ladies and gentlemen, the whole of Mumbai city, from Parel and perhaps even south of Parel, all the way to Vasai, all the way down to Naigaon and Alibag and Chanji across, all of this was very, very much a part and parcel of a territory ruled by a very, very interesting group of people who were first vassals and then independent rulers themselves. There's one image that I meant to put, which I completely forgot about, and I am very, very sorry about that. If you're all on a mailing list, I will send that image or you can look it up yourself. At the site of Iksar in Borivali are a series of 7 hero stones on which is portrayed a naval battle. And this was a naval battle fought by the Shilaharas that we know of. Yes, there is a stone at Mankeshwar temple with a Kannada inscription and a Kichak. The Kichak belongs to this period, Vinayak. The Kannada inscription actually belongs to the period of Aurangzeb, which is very, very fascinating in its own right. There is an article on that also by Harshada Virkud and Shivam Dubey. There is also an article on that by Anita Rane Kotare, and it is mentioned even earlier in a Marathi text. Sadly, the front part of the date is slightly damaged, but on the paleographical style, it cannot be anything but later medieval. But the Kichaka is not. So it's telling you about continuity even there. We also have a beautiful Gadegal splattered in cement from Pimpalwadi, much further south near Kalbadevi, and so on and so forth. So yes, thank you very much for that. So I was going to try and show you this old image that I had in black and white of all of these stones. And you can see at the bottom over here, the naval battle. You can see the kind of ships that are involved, multi-oared ships in a battle, you can see. So there would have been at least 2 more stories below. This is a very, very elaborate hero stone. 3 of the hero stones over here are completely intact. They have these massive Mangal Kalashas on the top with apsaras and so on and so forth around them. They cannot be anything but royal hero stones. We know the Shilaharas fought and lost a massive battle on the coast over here. We believe that these are the remnants of that battle and the aftermath of that battle. We know that Aparaditya talks in great anguish about how the land had been laid waste and how he had to be a healer to the land and the king had to bring the land back together again and so on and so forth with the people. So we know that there was surprisingly, we don't know of many great wars that the Shilaharas fought. The Shilaharas seem to be very, very benevolent kings. And apart from this one great action that was fought on land and sea against them, which they were badly battered in, there does not really seem to be much evidence at all, in fact, any evidence at all of any warlike behavior on the part of the Shilaharas, which makes them an even more interesting dynasty. For a dynasty not to have engaged in conquest, for a dynasty not to have enlarged its dominions in any way, and to have been content with what they had, uh, is something incredibly rare in India. The only other example I can give you is of the Siddhis of Janjira, who were more or less quite happy with what they had at Janjira. So uh, it's an amazing dynasty, and it lasted for a rather long period of time. There were some brilliant rulers. Many of them wrote commentaries on great texts. You have a beautiful commentary on the Yajnavalkya Smriti, which is still available to us today, which was written by Aparadeva. You have poetry written by them. You have references to temples being erected by them. Janja says that he erected 12 Shaivite shrines. We believe that Ambarnath, Lonad, and 1 or 2 others that we have tentatively identified, including one on the way to Kalyan from Navi Mumbai, all belong to this set of 12 temples belonging to this one period. Perhaps Mahim was one of them too, but much more work needs to be done before we can say anything conclusive. But what we can say is that from the 10th, 11th century AD onwards, all the way towards the second half of the 13th century AD, This region was a very, very important region. There were a number of urban centers, and it was not a backwaters as has been portrayed before. And civilization was not brought to us by the Portuguese and subsequently by the British. But the Mumbai metropolitan region was a very, very thriving urban center. And of course, that had a large rural component, which it had to in the medieval period. It now makes sense why the Gujarat Sultans occupied this region. It makes much more sense why in between the Gujarat Sultans, we have a virtually unknown king to most Mumbaikars, the very famous Maharaja Diraja who ruled Konkan Thane from Mahim Bimbas Thane, about whom I have been lecturing quite often, called Hambira Rao. We know that Hambira Rao comes along in a long row of illustrious kings like Bimba Deva, Pratapa Bimba, etc. We know that he is followed by the Naita Rajas, Alu Naita and Alu Nakwa before the coming of the Gujarat Sultans per se. We know that the Gujarat Sultans were in a very important port site at Mahim and controlled Bassein also because they had a fortification in the Bassein fort. So this entire region that we call Mumbai has been, at least for the last 2000 years, an incredibly thriving entrepot, a port site, an emporium with trade across the seas. We know in the Shillara and before that in the Rashtrakuta period that we have massive trade with West Asia. Excavations at Sanjan, work at Sopara have proved that the West Asian glazed wares are there in large quantities. West Asian glass is found in large quantities. We have evidence of coinage from there. Though sadly, the local coinage does not really say much.
So that was a great archaeological perspective. One of the questions, it's almost lying there asking to be asked, is there any work in consolidating all these fragments of archaeological remnants and consolidating them into one museum? Or
so there is great hope to do this. The tragedy is I have stopped sharing images of any finds apart from the ones that I've shown here, because those we've already talked about in great detail, because we've realized that they disappear from their locations. So there are many more and some very interesting finds that we have subsequently made, but we are not talking about them till we can find some way to house them. Farooq, what I want you to understand is some of them are very small and I could put them in a backpack and take them away. Most of them are too large to move without 3 or 4 people and a truck. That said, it's illegal to move them technically, even for archaeologists. So we need to have the collector to take an interest. And for Thane, we spoke to the collector in great detail. We had somebody in the collector's office who was doing archaeology and who spoke to the collector. The collector was all gung-ho about coming up with a plan. And then the collector got transferred. And the new collector said, I have better things to do and more important things to do than worry about broken stones.
So,
there is, by the way, no... the director of the State Department is desperately trying to create a museum in Mumbai. He says there is no Mumbai museum. Can you imagine? Maharashtra State Archaeology does not have a Mumbai museum.
Okay. I think the next question is also begging to be asked. We constantly hear of Raja Bim and Mahim and the Mahim police station. Where does he fit in with all the Shillara business?
Come back to Khaki Talks in September and we'll answer that question for you.
Great, forthcoming attraction. Somebody commented on the chat that was it Ram who shot the arrow, or was it Lakshman when you were talking about the legend of...
So I have always been told that it was Lakshmana who shot the arrow. Rama was too busy building Valkeshwar, Valukeshava.
Yeah.
So he was building the Valkeshwar mountain, which is this shivling made of sand, which he built for worship, and he asked Lakshmana to get water. Now, you can have as many versions of a story as you want. I have some rather ribald versions of this story also, and some very questionable versions which we shall not discuss in public.
All right.
The modern name of Tagara is Ter. Ter
Yes,
in Marathwada.
Yeah. I was going to come to that because that is a question which was asked right at the beginning. I suppose the person must be anxious to get to it right away. And you also mentioned that Tana Fort, and you spoke about Bodhbandar Fort. Rupali wanted to know if they're the same or they're different.
No, very different. There are three forts in Thana.
Yes.
There is
yes.
the Thana Fort, which had two small forts next to it, which don't exist, which were Portuguese.
Mhm.
Perhaps there was some Shillara fortification at the site. We don't know, but there was a temple for sure, because digging in the Thana Fort subsequently by the jails department has also yielded some very interesting evidence. Sadly, despite asking for permission to just go and photograph it, or for them to photograph the damn things and give us photographs, neither was forthcoming. The superintendent of jails wasn't very happy to entertain us at all. My students went there 4 or 5 times. They took letters and so on and so forth, but he didn't have the time for them. He was very busy. I'm
It's
sure.
it's not easy being an independent archaeologist, is it?
No. This was when I was with the university.
Okay. Okay.
Being an independent archaeologist is a different problem altogether. See, I can circumvent a lot of things that the university has to do. So I'll be very blunt about that. It's better being independent. You know what? There is a beautiful book by Mr. Tetwilkar, I think, on Thane. Ashe Gadle Thane. A small Marathi booklet. It actually has some grainy black and white pictures of the materials found inside. But it's a very small picture and it's grainy. So if I blow it up on this screen, you'll see nothing.
Dr. Kelkar wants to know this: considering the preponderance of Shiva temples and the Prabhavati temple in Worli, why is there no Shillara imprint in Worli?
How big was Worli back then? How important was Worli back then? And who says that there is no evidence of the Shilaharas from Worli?
So do tell us.
At Worli, there is a very interesting Gadegal fragment where the lower part has survived, very badly pitted and weathered. At the Worli temple itself, the Worli Gaunderi temple has in its premises a much weathered land grant stone, which appears to belong to the Shillara era. The problem is, in the absence of any script, it's very difficult because these these Gadegals then continued to be in use all the way to the 16th and 17th centuries AD.
Great.
So they were there. It was not that they weren't there. It's just that we've built up everything around there, and there's never been an excavation in Thane. Can you imagine that? There's never been an archaeological excavation in Thane.
But you are going to take us for a walk around Thane. It seems fascinating with all these pieces of stone lying around. Hope so.
In what script was ancient Marathi written? So it was mainly written in the Nagari script.
Now, another question, you mentioned Amalaka. Could you clarify a little bit more about
So right on the top of a Shikhara, you have something called a Kalasha, which looks like a beautiful pot in which there is a coconut.
Okay.
Okay. Under that, you have a flat stone disc, normally with a beveled edge. This is usually a single stone, and it sits on top and anchors all the stone blocks that make up the Shikhara.
Mhm.
And it also anchors the Kalasha on top. So it has a hole on the top for the Kalasha to fit into it, and it anchors the rest of it together through a series of joints. So this is called the Amalaka on top, and it has very interesting bevelings on the side, very decorative beveling, and that is a very common thing seen in temples all over India.
Were the Shilaras only plains people? I mean, did they build any hill forts is a question.
So there is n number of speculation about forts that belong to the Shilaras and pre-Shillara fortifications. I have never at a single fort found any such evidence. And I have been told, people have sworn to me that these forts belong to the Shilaharas, they belonged even before that to the Satavahanas. And my question has only been, on what basis? I mean, is there any historical fact to this? No, we believe so. So it's nice to believe, and I'm sure that there were fortifications of different types. We know that during the Yadava period, which followed the Shilaharas, that there were fortifications. But the kind of fortifications that we are used to are called the Saracenic style. And they came to us with the Islamic fort builders. So even the Marathas used the same style, the Saracenic style, all the way to the end. That is one of the reasons why the Maratha forts only on the mountaintops were so secure, and the ones were lower down took a massive beating like Panhala when Aurangzeb got there.
So how did the Shilaras, how did the dynasty end? And
So they completely got swamped sometime. Well, it was a double whammy. The Chalukyans did one part of it, the Yadavas did the other part of it, and by the middle of the 13th century AD, they were a spent force, and the Yadavas were rising in a massive manner, especially in the south, in Marathwada, and in parts of the Deccan, and extending their rule northwards. And very quietly, they got subsumed within. So there are a number of debates as to exactly how it happened, who the last king was, whether there was actually somebody after the second Keshideva or not. Uh, there was probably one. There is one inscription, but the dynasty came to an end. All good things come to an end.
yes, um, uh, this is not directly about the Shilaras, but would you explain a little bit about Shrigundi and where it sits in the governor's estate? And it's also said that the original Valkeshwar temple was at the governor's residence at some point in time.
I find it difficult to believe that the temple was there, and for it to it's a decent distance between the governor's house and the Valkeshwar tank. If you look at your Google image, okay, I really do not think that the temple would have been anywhere far away from the tank. Number one, almost every single other temple that exists there, including the remade Valkeshwar temple, are all later and much later, which tells you that you see, normally at a place like this, there would be one temple. It would have shrines attached to it. They would not be competing temples. Temples also are very possessive about their space. The other thing is that water, fresh water in the Konkan is a very, very expensive commodity, especially in the months of March, April, May, and June. And freshwater sources that are permanent sources on the coast are heavily guarded. Now, how do you make sure that nobody claims ownership of them? You give the gods their ownership. So if you go down the Konkan coast, for example, from Akshi downwards all the way to Janjira, you will find that every single temple has a tank attached to it. In fact, you can go beyond Janjira all the way to Diveagar. You will find that every single temple has a freshwater tank attached to it. And the purpose of the temple is more to safeguard the water and make sure that the water is available to all the populace. Well, all the populace is also, now never mind that, there are caste equations and such like, but is always available to the people. So I doubt very much that the temple was there. I have spoken to people at Valkeshwar. I was lucky enough to know people who lived more or less permanently in the governor's bungalow. The governor's doctor's sons were friends of mine in school. And thanks to them, I had a lot of access as a young child and then subsequently as a young man to the governor's property. Sadly, I was not an archaeologist at that time. And I've run the entire gamut of the property. Believe you me, there are a couple of very interesting small shrines of the later period, but there is no evidence whatsoever of anything large enough to belong to that period.
So the commander in our audience wants to know which were the main ports of the Shilaras.
Oh, so the ports of the Shilaras would be definitely Samyana, because we have Chittaraja's copper plates from there talking about it. Then there would be, next to Dahanu, there would be the port of Chinchani. So Samyana is Sanjan. So Sanjan, then Chinchani. From Chinchani, then you have Kelve Mahim. Okay. There, we have Tarapur also, but Tarapur and Chinchani are kind of more or less across the creek from each other. You have Kelve Mahim. From Kelve Mahim, you drop down to Agasem, okay, which is basically Agashi, modern day Arnala. Then there is Basin, of course, which we know definitely Sopara was a major port during this period. I mean, there's some amazing early medieval data. Sopara is a doomed archaeological site. Every single archaeological excavation at Sopara is unpublished to this day due to just some bizarre complications that arrive out of it. People are now frightened to excavate Sopara. It's like your death knell. You excavate Sopara and that's over. It's over. Everything ends in your academic life. But
Hopefully, we can have a talk by somebody on that very soon.
So Siddharth Kale has done a lot of work there. Suraj Pandit has done a lot of work there. In fact, he's done a lot of work on early historical Supara. We know Suparaka is mentioned again by Ptolemy, and we know of the mention of Supara by the Periplus also. So definitely it was a thriving port from the 2nd century AD. We have beautiful ceramics of the early medieval period from the Persian ceramics. We know that uh, the Supara Stupa, for example, was remade in the 8th century because the kind of images that were put inside it of the 8 Buddhas, and they definitely belong to that period. So there was definitely a lot of work going on there. There is Chakreshwar Tirth, which I haven't spoken about over there, which also has the remnants of the Shillara period. So there is a, so you know, there are, one can only do that much in this much time, but there is a huge amount of data lying around, and every time these lakes are cleaned, broken images which have been cast into the waters, which is the practice, put to rest as Jinodhar, are very often recovered. And today, because we're not so standoffish about broken images, they're all lined up in the courtyard of temples. So it's important to go to courtyards of temples and see what's lying there, and go downs of temples and so on and so forth.
So, since you mentioned Sopara, is it correct that Sopara was also mentioned in the was a famous port in biblical times, and that its name was Ophir?
So that is one of the, I would call it a trope personally, but yes, that is one of the stories that the ancient port of Ophir was actually Sopara. We don't really know, but we know that there were. So do you know that the first Christian bishop of the East was a Nestorian bishop at Thane? So way before the Catholics got here, the Nestorians were already here. We know that Jordanus speaks about it, Odoric speaks about it. So the sheer number of people coming through this place, if you were coming to the lands of the Northern Konkan, of Konkan Thane, you had to come to the port of Sopara. It was from Sopara that you would be taken to Shristhanake, and from there then, passages and so on and so forth would be given to you. So even Saint Bartholomew is supposed to have come here. Though that's highly doubtful.
You've whetted the appetite of Viral. He wants to go hunting for the Jew fragments. Can we tell him where he can go to see them?
And I have to remember the name of the place. It's a private house.
All
it's
right.
a private bungalow on Jew, and they rarely let people in today because they're sick and tired of these, archaeological heritage sorts wanting to prowl in their backyard.
Since Thane is so close to Airoli, is there anything of note in Airoli?
So far as I know, nothing.
Did the Shilaras engage in trade with the Indian Ocean rim? I mean, since you talked about ports and
yes, most definitely.
Yes.
Did they actively do it or not? I don't know. As in, did the Shilaras themselves have ships that went out? I don't know. But they definitely had ports. They controlled ports. They were called Vetakulas. We know that the Rashtrakutas even had Muslim governors way before there were any Muslims in the rest of India. And there's some very interesting data that comes out of the Rashtrakuta inscriptions that predate the Shilaras very slightly. And there is mention. So, by the way, for reasons I have been unable to understand, but every single Sanskritist I've spoken to tells me that it is the way it is. The name Muhammad translates into Sanskrit as Madhumati. Don't ask me how. Ask a Sanskritist. And we have a Tajik named Madhumati who was appointed as governor of the Vetakula of Samyana. So we know very categorically that there were traders coming in, various traders had settled here. I think Ibn Ishtikari talks about a Jama Masjid at Chaul. So, after Sopara, there would have been probably Puri or Gharapuri would have been a small port. And in the Panvel Creek, there would have been a port which has just been lost to us called Dungi. When we went down from Panvel, there would have been a number of ports at Chaul. Then south of Chaul, we know that there's an early medieval port site at Mandad. Then south of Mandad, again, you have, north of Mandad, you have Janjira, then you have Muru Janjira, then you have Mandad, then in the same creek. South of that, you have Diveagar. Diveagar was 100% a Shillara port. It was an island anchorage. So it was a massive sandbar and you could be on the other side of the sandbar, between the sandbar and the land, and it was a beautiful anchorage. There are 2 sets of copper plates of the Shilaharas and an inscription of Anantadeva III dated to 1245 AD, which is one of the last inscriptions of the Shilaharas. So
And
definitely,
sorry.
no, so I'm saying definitely this entire coast, and there was a lot of trade with the West Asian part, with parts of northern Eastern Africa. So, trade coming out of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf definitely came this way before it went down to Kerala and then Sri Lanka. And from there, kind of, it took a slingshot into the Malacca Straits and Indonesia and so on and so forth. So we have a lot of material moving both ways. We have very interesting finds of Chinese porcelains in India, Vietnamese porcelains in India, which I've just found in the last season of excavations, and I'm completely gobsmacked. I mean, I didn't even know there were Vietnamese porcelains.
Um, is there any material available how the common man lived in these times? The man in the street, so to speak. Is there anything on that?
Not really, not really. That only comes from archaeological excavations and the data from archaeological excavations. And sadly, that is categorized in a manner which is very unfriendly to the reader.
Okay. So I think we've come to the end of all the questions, Kurush. Most fascinating, as you can see from the comments which are there in the chat room, about how fascinating, how interesting it was. Very, very interesting, fascinating, etc., etc. I think that's all thanks to your eloquence and your making it sound so simple. It was almost like Shillaras for dummies. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody. Good night and have a
Thank you,
nice
Farokh, and
Sunday.
thank you, Bharat, and thank you all of you all for being such patient listeners. It's always a pleasure to engage with Kaki, and it's been a great pleasure to be here today and a great honor. Thank you very, very much to all of you all.